It's really an honor and pleasure of mine to have Dr. Paul Offit on the Healthcare Unfiltered podcast. I am a big fan from afar, although I have not met Paul in person. I'm hoping at some point I will, but I think we've all followed his work. Paul, welcome to the show. I've been really very much looking forward to having you on and really helping me and the listeners separating the signal from the noise. I know we're 2 years going to year number 3 of the pandemic, and you would think that the noise will subside a little bit. There are weeks where I think the noise actually increases significantly. We are taping this episode on 2/2/22. So I'm hoping that the Zoom actually works and everything will be fine. We'll be airing this next week. Just as to set the stage, Paul, there are maybe a few people out there who don't know you. Just tell us a little bit about yourself and how did you end up becoming a pediatrician and specifically interested in infectious disease?
Thanks. I think that the real answer to that question is that when I was 5, I was born with club feet, and my foot was operated on because the casting, I guess, as far as my father was concerned, didn't work well enough. So there was an operation performed on my right foot, which probably should have never been performed. That kind of operation wasn't perfected for another 40 years. So that was probably an operation that should have never been done, but it was done because, well, it was done. So, and it went badly. So I ended up ending in Kernan Children's Hospital, which at the time was called Kernan's Hospital for Crippled Children, because that was at a time when words like crippled and feeble-minded were in the names of children's hospitals. And I was there for about 6 weeks, and that was a polio ward. I mean, it was a chronic care facility for children, and I remember that like it was yesterday. I mean, it's kind of seared into my brain. There was one visiting hour a week on Sundays from 2 to 3. My father, who traveled a lot for his job, didn't visit me. My mother was in bed with a complication from her pregnancy with my brother, so she couldn't visit me. So I really was never visited. And I just remember looking out the window, which looked onto the front of that hospital, just waiting for somebody to come save me. But I also remember those children, how vulnerable and alone they were, and that disease, polio, certainly struck me. This was 1956. And I think that's it. I think maybe the passions of our adulthood are invariably a result of the scars of our childhood, and that may be it for me, just kind of a chronic treatment of myself. I think it's what drove me to medicine. I think it's what drove me to pediatrics. I think it's what drove me to write a book about polio. The first book I wrote was called The Cutter Incident, about what was the worst biological disaster in our country's history for a polio vaccine made wrong. But just digging through all that archival material in some way was cathartic for me. So I think that's why pediatrics, I think that's why pediatric infectious diseases.
And currently, Paul, you're in Pennsylvania. What's the scope of what your current role on faculty there and outside of your current role?
Right, so I'm an attending physician in the Division of Infectious Diseases at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. So I round on inpatients, about 8 weeks a year. I'm the director, along with Charlotte Moser, of the Vaccine Education Center at Children's Hospital, which we founded about 20 years ago to try and educate the press and the public about vaccines. So we create all these educational materials and our website. We've made little videos and movies. We made one video about how mRNA vaccines work that was retweeted by Patton Oswalt and Martina Navratilova and Mary Trump. So there it is. That's my career, and so that's mostly what takes up my time. And I still write books and give a lot of lectures, and so that takes up my time. And obviously, the last 2 years has just been overwhelming in terms of the demands of my time for this regarding this pandemic. I'm on the NIH active group, which is put together by Francis Collins to try and advise pharmaceutical companies on how best to make vaccines. I'm on the FDA's Vaccine Advisory Committee. I'm now on this consortium that is advising the White House about issues related to vaccines and therapeutics, and we'll actually be talking to the White House during a briefing tomorrow. So it's just been really, really busy. It's exciting. I mean, it's certainly educational, but it's like enjoying eating chocolate and being asked to swim in a vat of it every day. That's kind of how it feels.
So is it fair to say you know a couple of things about vaccines, like just a few things, not, I mean, not a lot, just a couple of things?
Not as much as the guy who I trained with. I think Stanley Plotkin was my mentor for decades. He was the chairman of the Division of Infectious Disease when I came to Children's Hospital Philadelphia. He is the inventor of the rubella vaccine. He's the co-inventor of the rotavirus vaccine. He did seminal work on the rabies vaccine, on anthrax vaccine. I mean, he knows much more about vaccines than I do. He in fact, he is the senior editor of the book Plotkin's Vaccines, this 1,600-page, 20,000 reference book. So all of which he knows. So he's amazing.
But you also, I mean, you co-invented some of these vaccines, and in your as you were part of co-inventing these vaccines, it's fair to say it takes a long time, right? I mean, what is it measured in years usually?
So I'm the co-inventor of one vaccine with Stan Plotkin and Fred Clark. We created the strains that became the rotavirus vaccine, Rotatech. 26 years is what that took from start to
26 years. So I think we can all agree that the vaccines for COVID were obviously in record time. So
11 months. I don't want to sound jealous, but 11 months from isolating that virus and sequencing it to the first two large clinical trials, 11 months. That's the fastest vaccine ever made. It's remarkable, actually.
Yeah. I should know this, but I actually don't. Are you writing a book on COVID?
I am. I'm going to be the person who writes a book about COVID. No, I'm just kidding. I'll be one of 1 million people who write a book.
Yeah, but I'm going to read your book. I have not bought any of the other books. I'm not going to lie. I think, and you know why, Paul, to be honest, is I genuinely believe that there are lots of books out there that are politicized. I think we live in a very heavily charged political environment, and the public, the general public, want honest truth, non-biased, and science should not be politicized. And that's why I think a lot of books out there have a political gain, and I think yours will not.
So the subtitle of this book, still working on the title, the subtitle of this book is How a War Against a Virus Became a War Against Ourselves.
Yeah, I love it. Okay, I'm going to be a subscriber. So I want to talk about COVID. Obviously, I think there's a lot of things that we can talk about, and I realize we can't cover everything. But the first thing I want to start with is, in general, as we look at efficacy and toxicity of vaccine and so on, when we are faced with a pandemic, how much of our policy should be driven by actual data and randomized controlled trials and so on, versus sometimes you just can't. You just have to be pragmatic and just move on and pontificate using your best clinical judgment. And I think there's a lot of this chatter out there into, well, there is no evidence of wearing masks is going to help. There is no evidence X, Y, and Z. How much studies do we need in a randomized controlled fashion as we decide on policy in a pandemic?
Right, and I think that's the issue. The issue is how about during a pandemic? I mean, so here's the way I would see it. I mean, when we did our rotavirus vaccine trials, you could argue in this country, in the United States, rotavirus would cause about 75,000 children every year to be hospitalized with fever and vomiting and diarrhea and the dehydration that was a consequence of that. It would kill maybe 60 children a year in this country. In the world, it would kill 2,000 children a day. I mean, it was arguably rotavirus were the single biggest killer of infants and young children in the world, including malaria, tuberculosis, HIV. It was the single biggest killer. So should that have moved things quicker? You could argue reasonably, yes. But the trial that we did, there was a randomized, prospective, placebo-controlled, 70,000 child, 11 country, 4-year, probably $350 million trial to prove that vaccine was safe and effective. Now, how about during a pandemic? Now, for example, there was an outbreak of Ebola in West Africa. There were strategies to make a vaccine, actually one of which is very similar to Johnson & Johnson's and AstraZeneca strategy of using this vectored adenovirus approach. So do you do randomized controlled trials in West Africa when there's an Ebola outbreak that's killing thousands of people? And the answer was no. So what was done was basically they just rolled out the vaccine, and you could see, because they couldn't give it to everybody at the same time, you could see many people got the vaccine, many people didn't get the vaccine. So you could see then essentially retrospectively what the efficacy of the vaccine and what the safety of the vaccine was. So that was one way to do it. The way it was done here during the pandemic, whether it was Pfizer or Moderna's vaccine, and the data were presented to our FDA advisory committee on December 10th and December 17th of 2020, was to do those trials quickly. I mean, so those were 3-month trials. That's the size of the trials was typical of any vaccine trial, adult or pediatric. 40,000 for Pfizer, 30,000 for Moderna. The length of safety follow-up was the same for any pediatric or adult vaccine, 2 months after the last dose, because any serious adverse event that occurs typically occurs within 2 months. But what was different was the efficacy follow-up. Those were 3-month trials. So that was done quickly. Now, as you move to younger and younger children who were less likely to get infected and less likely to get severely infected, I mean, most of the deaths, I think 85% of the deaths from people over 65 years of age and 93% in people over 55, then you still did trials. You still did clinical trials, but with much smaller numbers. Therefore, they too were done much more quickly. So I think it's a hard question to answer, but I'll tell you, it's here's a perfect example. When we, the FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee, approved the vaccine, recommended that the 5 to 11-year-old vaccine be approved by the FDA, and it was eventually approved, I got a lot of angry letters. I mean, that understates it. It was like one a minute. I think I got, in the few days before we met, 3,000 emails from people saying, don't vote it, and the usual sort of, references to Nazis and Nuremberg codes and experimenting on people unfairly. But the theme of the more rational ones was, this is a 2,400 child trial that they're presenting, right? Roughly, it was 2-to-1 vaccine to placebo. So 1,600 children get vaccine, 800 get placebo, so 750 got placebo. That's it? That's all you want to do? 2,400 children? You just did a 40,000 person trial in adults. You're going to now make a decision for the 5 to 11-year-old. That's 28 million children who could get this vaccine. Based on 2,400 children, only 1,600 of whom got a vaccine. That's what you're going to make your decision on? When do you know enough? And that's a fair question. When do you know enough? Because you never know everything. The question is, when do you know enough to pull the trigger? And my response was, okay, in this trial, the 5 to 11-year-old trial, there were 16 children who suffered COVID in the placebo group. We could do it, instead of doing a 2,400 child trial, we can do a 24,000 child trial, in which case then it wouldn't be 16 children who suffered COVID, it would be 160 children who suffered COVID. How much of a price, human price, do you want to pay for knowledge? And the example I'll use here, because it's the reason I wrote this most recent book I wrote called You Bet Your Life. It was the emotional drive for that book. It was basically that all medical innovations are associated with a human cost. Was when Jonas Salk made his polio vaccine. And again, this is the passion for me of polio. What did he do? He took the virus, grew it up in the laboratory in monkey kidney cells. He purified it. He inactivated it with a chemical formaldehyde. Then he gave it to 700 children in and around Pittsburgh, found that it was safe, found that it induced a protective, what he felt would be likely a protective immune response. And he said, that's it. Got it. Eureka. Said it to his wife, Donna. Got it. But there was an insistence by the March of Dimes that there be a clinical trial, a randomized controlled clinical trial. He didn't want to do that. He didn't want to give placebo, salt water, to first and second graders in the 1950s when polio was paralyzing 20 to 30,000 children a year and killing 1,500. He just couldn't conscience that. But that's what was done. So 420,000 children got his vaccine, 200,000 children got placebo. And when it was over, that 1-year trial was over, the largest trial of a medical product in history. Thomas Francis, who headed that trial, stood up at the podium at Rackham Hall in the University of Michigan and said those 3 famous words: safe, potent, effective. Well, how did he know it was effective? He knew it was effective because 16 children died of polio in that study, all in the placebo group. He knew it was effective because 36 children were paralyzed in that study, 34 in the placebo group, permanently paralyzed. Those were first and second graders in the 1950s. I was a first and second grader in the 1950s. Those children could have lived long, productive, fruitful lives, but for the flip of a coin. So this is what I think is always what we struggle with, what I struggle with on the FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee. When do you know enough? How much of a price do you want to pay before you pull the trigger?
These are absolutely, critical points. And I think when we look at the kids, I do feel that when do we know enough? I mean, so you feel for 5 to 11 was enough, but then when they just recently reviewed the younger than 5 years old, the application was pulled or something, that this is not
No, we never reviewed it. So we were supposed to meet on February 15th
right.
to review a 3-dose trial for the less than 5-year-old by Pfizer, but they only had data on the first 2 doses. I just think that was an ill-conceived idea. What you would have had, if we were to approve it, we would have had to have assumed that the 3rd dose was more effective, although we didn't know that. We would have had to have assumed that the 3rd dose was safe, which we didn't know. I just don't think there's any chance we would have approved that. So I think didn't make sense to have that meeting. I'm not sure Pfizer wanted that at that meeting. I'm not sure the FDA wanted that meeting. I'm not sure why that meeting.
So what happened there? Did something happen that they initially wanted to have it, then because a lot of chatter after this did not happen, that maybe there are some issues pertaining to efficacy and death in the vaccine arm, and that was the rumor.
No, I think it should have never been scheduled. I think my understanding is that they will have their data on a 3-dose vaccine by the end of March, beginning of April. Then we presumably will have a scheduled meeting sometime in April. We just should have waited. I don't think that the thinking behind that initially was, all right, well, let's it's a 3-dose vaccine, but let's approve 2 doses. We'll start getting 2 doses out there, and then children can be protected. But that makes a lot of assumptions about what that 3rd dose was going to offer. And so I think it was always an ill-conceived idea, which is why the meeting should have never been scheduled. I don't think this had anything to do with whether there was a safety problem, i.e. a clinical hold on the vaccine. I don't think that was true. So I don't know anything else about this 3-dose vaccine, but hopefully we'll in April.
When it comes to safety, you mentioned something really important. You said the most serious adverse events will happen in the first couple of months from the vaccine. And there are a lot, so for longer term, folks use the VAERS, as you and I know, and it's not really great, but it's probably what we have. What's your opinion about VAERS, and for folks that just get into this and try to analyze these self-reported adverse events? Do we just completely say whatever comes out of VAERS is not helpful, or is there some merit to it?
Right, so VAERS, the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System, is misnamed. It should be called more reasonably the Suspected Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System. I think people, when they look at that title, think these are vaccine adverse events, and they're 99.999% of them aren't. I think the best you can say about the VAERS system is that it's a hypothesis generating system. So, for example, there was a rotavirus vaccine that was introduced in the United States in the late 1990s by Wyeth. It was called RotaShield. VAERS was actually the first to report that children within a week or 2 of getting this vaccine developed an intestinal blockage called intussusception. So that's all you knew. Got a vaccine, had intussusception. Now, intussusception does occur in the United States every year, even before there was a rotavirus vaccine. So the question is, was the vaccine causing it? Was this coincidental association or a causal association? You can never figure that out from VAERS, because VAERS only gives you one piece of information. Got a vaccine, had a problem. You need 3 other pieces of information. Got a vaccine, didn't have a problem, didn't get the vaccine, had a problem, or didn't have a problem. You need those 4 pieces of information. So that generated the hypothesis, could this vaccine have been doing this? So then we looked at the vaccine safety data link, which then looks at children who did or didn't get the vaccine to answer the question, were those children who got the vaccine at greater risk? And the answer was yes. So VAERS picked that up. VAERS also picked up myocarditis early as a consequence of the mRNA vaccine. And this thrombosis with thrombocytopenia syndrome associated, it's the blood clotting problem associated with the J&J and AstraZeneca vaccines. So I think VAERS has a role, but it is so misused that I really do think it does infinitely more harm than good. If you turn on Tucker Carlson at Fox News, what you find is him saying last May, 3,300 people have died of this vaccine because deaths are reported. Hank Aaron, when he got this vaccine to his 86-year-old man, he 2 weeks after getting the vaccine had a stroke and died. And that was reported by a number of outlets as that was caused by the vaccine. Had he been reported to VAERS, that would have been in VAERS as a death following the vaccine. But, He was an 86-year-old African-American man who had a stroke. I mean, that happens when you're an older person, and happened to him. The vaccines only prevent vaccine preventable diseases. They don't prevent everything else that happens in life. And that's the problem with VAERS. It's horribly misused. And so I really do think on balance, it's done more harm than good, to be honest.
So let's talk about a little bit about, because I want to get to boosters, but before I do that, now we talked about the efficacy of the vaccines in the 5 to 11. We're waiting on the data or the meeting for the younger children, and we talked about the efficacy in adults. Before we talk about boosters and the data on that, vaccine mandates became, again, a heavily politicized saga, and especially for children also. Any thoughts on vaccine mandates and on, I don't know, if you don't get vaccinated, you lose your job. If you're not vaccinated, you can't get into a restaurant. What is someone like yourself, like you, think about vaccine mandates?
Here's how I think about them. I think that vaccines are our ticket out of this pandemic. We're not going to boost our way out. We're not going to test our way out. The only way to get out of this pandemic is to vaccinate, and the vaccine works and is safe. So what do? I mean, the Trump administration performed a medical miracle as far as I'm concerned. Operation Warp Speed was an amazing success. In 11 months, you made a highly successful, highly safe, highly effective vaccine. The Biden administration then did the next hard part, figured out how to mass produce it, mass distribute it, mass administer it in a country that doesn't have really a public health system to mass administer vaccines to adults, all for free. And then we were giving, at the beginning of the Biden administration, 1 million doses a day. Then it was 2 million doses a day. Then it was 3 million doses a day. Then it was 4.5 million doses a day. And then we hit a wall. So we vaccinated now around 2/3 of this population and hit a wall. We haven't budged really since then. So that's the question. Of those people who haven't been vaccinated, it is political or cultural. I mean, it's this kind of libertarian, government off my back. Don't tell me what to do. Don't tell me how to raise my family. Don't tell me whether or not I have to vaccinate it. And I think for the tetanus vaccine, that's fine, right? You cut your foot on a rusty nail. You go to the doctor washes out your foot, offers you a tetanus vaccine. You say no. And then you get tetanus. Well, no one's going to catch tetanus from you. It's not a contagious disease. This is a contagious disease. You're not just making a decision for yourself. People catch this virus from people often who aren't vaccinated because they shed more virus. So is that your right? Is it your right as an American citizen to catch and transmit a potentially fatal infection? I think it's not. And I have a lot of sympathy for the Biden administration when they really try to essentially make people get a vaccine, because it's not the only time we have mandates in public health. If you have a small child, you are asked to put them in a car seat. And if not, in New Jersey, it's click it or ticket. If you don't have your child in the car seat, you could get a ticket, and that's fine. I think that affects other people less. Here, I understand it. I do think we've gone as far as we can go. I'll give you an example. Actually, when I was on service a couple months ago. We admitted a lot of kids with COVID. This was a couple months ago. Now it's much, much, much less than that. I mean, clearly it's declining in Philadelphia, but there was a family who came in, right? So this child was an adolescent who was unvaccinated, who was pretty seriously ill. I mean, he eventually went to the ICU. The mother was unvaccinated. The siblings were unvaccinated, and this child was unvaccinated. The father was vaccinated. Why? Because he had to be for work. There's something to be said for that. I think it's a hard question to answer. I wish we didn't have to. In a better world, you wouldn't need mandates.
What do you think about get a vaccine? What do you think about vaccine mandates for children, though? I mean, because one argument is that children are less affected, less ill. They don't get as seriously ill, and then if the adults are vaccinated around them, do we need to mandate the children? And the only reason I mention that is because some folks say, to your earlier point, Paul, when we first started, that the data on the vaccines in children, just a couple of thousand children. So do we need to mandate it for children like adults?
Well, so how many children have died of this virus? I mean, how many people less than 18 years of age have died from this virus? About 1,000. It's a lot. I mean, we mandate a measles vaccine. We mandate a mumps vaccine, rubella, German measles vaccine, polio vaccines. We mandate those vaccines for school entry because those viruses are often, especially measles, for example, are often pass from one person to another in school. And we were able to essentially eliminate from this measles from this country the most contagious of the vaccine preventable diseases by the year 2000 because of school mandates. So does this vaccine deserve a school mandate? In other words, is there enough disease in young children, infants and young children, to explain to reasonably offer mandates or require a mandate for this? I think the answer is yes. You make a good point. Let's suppose everybody all the teachers are vaccinated, everybody in your family's vaccinated. But when the data were presented to us for the 5 to 11-year-old, what surprised me the most is that doing seroprevalence studies on that age group, 40% of children had already been infected, which tells you your point. Most of those infections were asymptomatic. But when I was on service a couple months ago, we admitted 18 children during the week that I was on service. All of them were over 5. None of them were vaccinated, and a handful of them, 5, went to the intensive care unit. If you can prevent that safely, prevent it. And it is upsetting to me that parents chose not to vaccinate. I mean, the vaccine for the 5 to 11-year-old was approved in early November, so there'd been a couple months really for those children to be vaccinated, and the parents chose not to vaccinate them, and therefore those children suffered and were hospitalized, and some went to the ICU and had to be ventilated. If that can be safely prevented, it should be. It's upsetting to me that a parent would choose to not do that. If I had children in that age group, I certainly would vaccinate them.
I think the question that comes up, for example, safely vaccinate. So, can we get by with 1 dose versus 2 doses because of the risk of myocarditis that just keeps coming up in terms of young boys specifically, or young men specifically? At least that's what really has been published. So in other words, in medicine, as an oncologist, I've always believed one hat never fits all. So is there a reason why we can think we can maximize the administration for kids while minimizing possible side effects? Why give 2? Why not give 1? All of these things. And anytime you try to propose that, the assumption becomes that you're really an anti-vaxxer.
Yeah, here's what I would say. I think the incidence of myocarditis in the 16 to 29-year-old is roughly 1 per 20,000. Myocarditis is a scary word, means inflammation of the heart muscle. But the good news is it does appear to be a transient self-resolving phenomenon. It's not like the myocarditis associated with, say, Coxsackie virus, where children often go to the ICU, and 4 to 9% of those children will have to have a heart transplant. I mean, that's not this. I wish we had a different word for this, because the word myocarditis never sounds good. I mean, mild myocarditis sounds like a contradiction in terms. So that is the risk. 1 in 20,000 for the 16 to 29-year-old. Now, COVID also causes myocarditis. If you look at, for example, a study that was done in the Big Ten conference, where what they did cardiac MRIs on everybody who had COVID, everybody, symptomatic or not, with heart symptoms, everybody gets an MRI. And what they found was that the incidence of myocarditis in that group was 1 in 45, 2.5%. 1 in 45, so 1 in 20,000 versus 1 in 45. And the myocarditis associated with COVID is more serious, especially associated with MIS-C, this multi-system inflammatory disease, this post-infectious inflammatory disease of the 5 to 13-year-old, primarily the 9-year-old. I mean, that's a much more serious form of myocarditis. So again, there's no risk-free choices, just choices.
Yeah, but I mean, you think we can avoid those 2, for example?
Here's the problem with that. The problem with that is the goal of the vaccine is to induce memory cells, which will then give you protection against serious illness. The best way to induce high frequencies of memory B cells and memory T helper and cytotoxic T cells is with that second dose. To not get the second dose is to dramatically decrease, I think, your chance of having long-lived protection against serious illness.
Let's talk about boosters. I think there are sometimes jokes circulating on WhatsApp and on the internet. Booster number 4, 5, 6, 7, and the ones that. But in all seriousness, when we talk about,
you get the free pizza.
Yeah, exactly. You get the free pizza. But let's talk about boosters. I mean, this is really an open-ended questions, because there are boosters for adults and then boosters for children. And, I think we can do a randomized controlled trials to look at the efficacy of boosters. And I also, you have people who have had COVID. So you've gotten the the 2 shots, you've got COVID, do you need a booster? I mean, it's a whole lot of things to actually uncover. And I kind of feel, at least when I listen to many public health officials, not you, that everybody should get a booster if you're an adult, 3rd dose, if you're immunocompromised, 4 doses. And that's it. And I get confused.
It's confusing. Here's what I would say. The goal of the vaccine is to protect against serious illness. The way in which you do that is you generate high frequencies of memory B and T cells. This is where the CDC could help us out, but hasn't, because they have these data. I don't think you need to do a randomized control trial. There are so many people who have gotten 2 doses, so many people who've gotten 3 doses with all different kinds of comorbidities or not, that you can answer this question. They have the data to answer this question. But here's what I would say the data shows so far. With the data, and I don't use the word booster, because the word booster implies boosting something, and what you're boosting is neutralizing antibodies for about 3 months, and that doesn't matter, because what that does is that protects you against mild disease for a few months. The most important thing is how many doses do you need to induce high frequencies of memory B and T cells to protect you against serious disease? I think that where a 3-dose vaccine is clearly of value, or necessary even, is for people who are over 65 years of age. Although if you look at the data, it's really people over 70 years of age. But for the purpose of this discussion, we'll say people over 65. I think at 3 doses are clearly of value, at least if you're immune compromised, although the term immune compromised obviously is a very broad term. There are different levels of being immune compromised, certainly at least 3 doses, and arguably for some people 4 doses. I think 3 doses, it's a 3-dose vaccine for people who have multiple comorbidities, that put them at highest risk of being hospitalized. I think it is a 3-dose vaccine. I think for healthy young people less than 50 years of age, people 18 or 12 to 49 years of age, who don't have those comorbidities, I don't see any evidence why you need a 3rd dose. I don't. And I have challenged, arguably, those people at the CDC to please provide evidence behind that recommendation, because that's the recommendation. I mean, the FDA basically, without going to our committee, I'd like to say, without going to the FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee, basically said, yes, this can be, you can have a booster dose for everybody over 18, and then the CDC said, okay, and then the FDA said you can have a booster dose for everybody over 12, and then the ACIP also said, okay, for reasons that escape me. Because what happened was, by making that recommendation for people, say healthy young people, without evidence that clearly increases your protection against serious illness, then the mandates came, because now you had a recommendation. If they'd made it a should be considered recommendation, a permissive recommendation, the mandates wouldn't have come. And with the mandates came the anger. And I certainly get emails from people, understandably, who say, look, I have a healthy boy who's going to college and he can't get in till he gets his can't get back on campus till he gets a 3rd dose. I think there's a risk of myocarditis. I don't think there's much benefit here. I don't think he should get that vaccine. I agree. I mean, my child is my children. I have a boy and a girl in their 20s. My son asked me whether I thought he should get a booster dose, and I said no.
And somebody,
what people have to realize is that he doesn't listen to me. His girlfriend told him to get a 3rd dose, so he got it. But just so we're clear,
but because you did this, you were called by some as anti-vaxxer, Paul. Did you know that?
Yeah, I know. I think when the right starts to embrace, when the anti-vaxxers start to embrace you, you probably can assume you're wrong. But I don't see myself that way.
No, but I do think. I mean, I have 2 boys as well, and they're vaccinated, but I did not do the booster. To your point, I really did not see that evidence. But for those who are listening, what evidence do you want to see for boosters in the younger younger people?
I want to see who's getting hospitalized and why. If we know the people, there's obviously a large and disproportionate number of people who are hospitalized that are unvaccinated. I mean, they are basically the people who are hospitalized. I can tell you that at Children's Hospital Philadelphia, when we see children admitted to the hospital, they're never vaccinated. So the unvaccinated get hospitalized. Of those who are hospitalized who are vaccinated, say have gotten 2 doses of vaccine, but despite that who are hospitalized, who are they? How old are they? Do they have comorbidities? If so, what are those comorbidities? So we can target that 3rd dose to them. That's all I'm asking for. Those data exist, and I just wish the CDC would be willing to substratify the information they have when they publish these articles in MMWR to let us know that.
Why do you think they're not doing that? Like, I mean, you're well connected with the CDC, and I mean, why is there? That's where That's where I think the public sometimes started losing trust because, to your point, they have the data, they could share it with us, no?
I would think so. I don't know why. Maybe they just feel it is not yet, it's not robust enough or internally consistent or validated. And so they feel that the data are not ready for prime time, which is basically what they've said. And I don't know, because I don't know the data. And certainly it's true that among researchers, there's often disagreements about whether something is ready for prime time. And certainly that's what aired in that article in the New York Times the other day, when basically I think some of those researchers stepped forward and said, we do have these data. So I don't know. I mean, I think the CDC is under no obligation to publish data they think is not ready yet. But if they have these data and they're ready, we do need to see them, because the recommendation preceded the science. The recommendation was give a booster dose to everybody over 12 without any real evidence that you had better protection against serious illness. Now, what that did do is it did increase neutralizing antibodies for a few months and would then lessen your chance of getting a mild infection with Omicron. But that's really not a public health strategy. If we're this is a mucosal virus. If we're gonna try and keep boosting, to prevent mild illness, then you're talking about several boosters a year, which is not a viable public health strategy.
Let's talk about a few other things, and I promise you I'll get you off on time, because I know you have another obligation. But there are a couple of topics that I really think are very important. One of them is asymptomatic testing. I'll probably, in my opening monologue, I'll offer my opinion. Hey, what the heck? I'll just tell my opinion. I think it's useless. I think just testing just people for the sake of testing is probably the most useless thing I've ever heard of. And my God, I mean, maybe it's slowing down a little bit right now. The way I know this, because I go to Walgreens and all of the testing are still there on the shelves. Nobody's buying them anymore. Why did the government, you don't speak for the government, why we invested so much money to send these 4 tests for everyone, and everybody now tests at their own? What is your opinion about asymptomatic testing?
I think we're driving ourselves crazy, is my opinion. I think the biggest communications error that was made with this vaccine was on July 4th of 2021, when there was an outbreak of COVID in Provincetown, Massachusetts. So there's a gathering of thousands of men. They get together. They're celebrating July 4th. Roughly 80% are vaccinated with 2 doses of an mRNA vaccine. Despite that, 346 men get COVID. 4 of those 346 are hospitalized for a hospitalization rate of 1.2%. Great. That's a vaccine that's working. The rest of them had asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic disease, which were sadly referred to as breakthrough illnesses. That's a terrible term. If we're trying to hold this vaccine to protection against mild disease, we're going to drive ourselves crazy, because no mucosal vaccine does that. Not the flu vaccine, not the rotavirus vaccine. It's an impossible standard. That's a win. Those 342 men who were vaccinated in the midst of an outbreak, who had only mild disease, won. When Queen Elizabeth, who's gotten 2 doses of a vaccine, she refuses to say whether she'd gotten a 3rd dose, but let's assume she got 2 doses of a vaccine. She's 95. She has a mild illness. She's doing light work around Buckingham Palace. That's a win. That's a win. So, and we just keep inadvertently damning the vaccine. I think similarly, when President Biden got up on August 18th and said, as of September 20th, we are going to have a booster dose for everybody over 16 years of age, without ever running this by the FDA or without ever running it by the CDC. What did he do? He said 2 doses aren't enough. So here you have this amazing vaccine that's remarkable in its capacity to protect against serious illness, that is remarkably safe, considering it's been given to like 4.5 billion people in this world have received COVID vaccines. I mean, this is the biggest vaccine program in history, and it is remarkably safe. And nonetheless, we just keep inadvertently damning it. 2 doses isn't enough. And also this notion, which was also born of that Provincetown outbreak, they said that the CDC said that it didn't matter whether you were vaccinated or not, and you had mild illness. If you were vaccinated, had mild illness. You were unvaccinated, had mild illness. You still were just as contagious. Wrong. That was wrong. You are much less contagious if you've gotten vaccinated than if you weren't vaccinated. So again, they damn the vaccine.
There are medical meetings that take place. In order for you to get into the hallway, you have to test every single morning to get in the room.
Imagine if we did this with flu. I imagine if we did this with flu, tests by PCR who is asymptomatically infected. I mean, you would realize you're on a mountain of flu. You're staying on a mountain of flu. You're just trying to keep people out of the hospital and keep them from dying. I mean, Pandemic 101 saved the healthcare system. That's happened.
Yeah. So non-pharmacologic intervention, that is my last topic. And non-pharmacologic intervention, social distancing, masks, cloth masks, K95, whatever you want to call it. I may want to talk about masking in restaurants and planes before I let you go, because it's crazy, I think. But non-pharmacologic interventions, how much studies do we need for masking or not masking children in schools, not masking in schools, all of these things? Because there are 2 points, two point and counterpoint. What are your thoughts on NPIs as we call them?
Well, I mean, so this is a virus that is transmitted by the respiratory route. I mean, initially that wasn't clear. I mean, when you saw nursing homes, initially nursing homes and cruise ships, people thought, maybe there's a fecal oral component to this. And that's when we talk about, washing surfaces well, like for norovirus. But that wasn't true. So it's respiratory route, and it's spread by small droplets. I mean, do masks, well-fitting masks, prevent the entrance or exit of small droplets? Yes, they do. So I think there are a number of studies done that have shown that if you do the study correctly, that it worked, that masks do have a value. Now, there was that Arizona study that came out that the CDC trumpeted that unfortunately was not a well-done study, and it was unfortunate that they trumpeted it, and it sort of cast down. And also, I think when Dr. Fauci very early on in the pandemic said that you didn't need to wear masks if they didn't work, and then then we were wearing masks, that was very confusing. I think masks have been confusing. I think the answer to the question of masks is it's not going to matter over time. I mean, I when I'm in Philadelphia, I can tell you everybody wears a mask. They wear masks outside. If you go inside to the grocery store, everybody wears a mask. Right now, I am in a place in Avalon, New Jersey, where no one wears a mask. I mean, go to the grocery store, no one, even the checkout people don't wear masks. Nobody wears a mask. So I think people are going to do what they're going to do, and it almost doesn't matter what the CDC says at this point.
I mean, it's about the mandates. Like, if you're on a plane, you can lower your mask and eat and drink for an hour, and it's okay. But the minute you stop eating and drinking, you have to put a mask. I feel this is theater.
I think it's sort of just how people feel. I think it makes them feel like they're protected. And so you're more nervous if you're sitting next to somebody who you don't know. You don't know whether they're vaccinated. You don't know whether they have mild illness, and you just would prefer they wear a mask. I do think this is going to happen. It's February 22nd right now. Today, we are talking on February 22nd. The numbers are clearly starting to come down with hospitalizations, and they will follow with the numbers will come down with deaths, which is really all you care about. I wish we'd stop talking about cases, because a lot of the cases aren't reported, especially when people do home antigen testing, and who cares? What you really care about is, are we winning in terms of hospitalizations and deaths? And the answer is yes. And it's just going to get better as the weather gets warmer. And we're going to hit summer, and the number is going to be way down. And I think we're not going to have this conversation anymore. But I do think if it's like human coronaviruses, and I think it is, this will be a winter virus. And it'll come back again as it did last winter. It'll come roaring back. And the degree to which it roars back will be much more blunted than it was this winter, because we have probably 90% population immunity at this point. Between natural infection and immunization, you probably have 90% population immunity. So we're getting there, I think.
And I think to your point, it probably won't matter. I think what people get rubbed off wrong is the mask mandates and children masking, because I can tell you in the school district of my children, all of the teachers are vaccinated, 100%. 90% of the kids are vaccinated. There are no infections happening in the district, and then they still have to wear masks 8 hours a day. I mean, that's where, like, wear them if you want and don't wear them if you don't want. But I think whenever you put the word mandate to your earlier point, people start thinking this is infringement of freedom and so on. Before I let you go, my last question is, if you want to give a mark to the CDC, you want to give them a grade to the CDC and the WHO, how do you think they performed over the past year?
Well, I mean, I used to be on a voting member of the advisory committee for immunization practice. I know a lot of people at the CDC, so it's sort of hard for me to give them a grade. I give them, I guess, a B minus. I think that they've been good at generating a number of critical epidemiological studies that have been helpful. But I really do think they could do a better job of communicating, which is hard for me to say that, because I think Rochelle Walensky is great. She is such an empathetic person. She really cares. She really wants to do the right thing. She's come out of an academic setting, and now she's in at some level, a political setting. And I think that's not necessarily easy for anybody. And I guess if fantasies could come true, I would like to see the CDC do what it did in 2009 with the swine flu pandemic. What you had was you had the CDC director then, Richard Besser, every other day in front of the media, every other day answering questions, which is basically questions from the public. It's what the public wants to know, and I wish that happened. I think that would help. In terms of the WHO, I do think if there's one thing I hope we learn from this pandemic, we need an international surveillance system for these kinds of viruses. I mean, we should not have had to have depended on a whistleblower in Wuhan to tell us that dozens of people were dying of unusual pneumonia. I mean, we were way behind the eight ball as a world before we knew that. That shouldn't happen. China was not a reasonable neighbor here. And also those markets where they had a lot of species close together that were the mammals that should not legally have been sold, like the raccoon dogs and civets and stuff. That can't happen. I mean, there is a responsibility to this world, I think, for each of these countries.
Well, are there any questions I should have asked you that you think are important to listeners? I think we hit so many things, but anything specific that you really think I should have asked that's really important?
No, I think that I guess I would conclude with this. I think we are going to move from a pandemic to an endemic situation, and you'd think that there's like a statistical description for endemic, but it's not. The definition of endemic is you basically don't change your life. So you don't wear masks, you don't social distance, you do all the things business-wise and school-wise that you would have done otherwise, which is what we do with flu. I mean, 2 years before this pandemic hit, influenza caused about 700,000 hospitalizations and 60 deaths in this country, which we grandfather in. I mean, if we masked and social distance and were much more aggressive about flu vaccination, we could lessen those numbers. We don't. We live with them. I don't know what that line is for COVID, but there will be a line where we say we can live with this degree of hospitalization and death because this virus isn't going away for a while. I mean, realize we still vaccinate children every year in this country for polio, even though we haven't had a case of polio in this country since the 1970s, almost 50 years. Why? Because it still exists in the world, Pakistan, Afghanistan. Think about how long this virus is going to be existing in this world and mutating in this world. So we're going to need to have a highly immune population for years, if not decades. So I really, when I think about vaccinating children, one of the reasons I argue with or talk to parents about it is these children are going to need to be protected for a long time. You're protecting them also when they become adolescents and adults, because
this is not a vaccine we're going to get every year, right? You just get the 2 or 3 shots and you're done.
It depends on how long protection lasts against serious illness, and that's where the CDC needs to consistently give us data. That Provincetown outbreak, where you had basically 346 people who were infected and 1.2% were hospitalized, that's the number you need. It's not the number of people who are hospitalized that are vaccinated. That's not the number, because ultimately, if 100% of the population is vaccinated, 100% of people who are hospitalized will have been vaccinated, because the vaccine is not 100% effective. The number you need is what percentage of people who are vaccinated are hospitalized, because that tells you the vaccine is not protecting against serious disease. And who are those people? How old are they? What are their comorbidities? Are they immune suppressed? That's what you need to know. Those are the data that constantly need to be generated, because there may be a variant that is created that is resistant to protection against moderate to severe disease. Because now those basically those epitopes on SARS-CoV-2 spike protein that are conserved are not conserved on a new variant, and then you're talking about another vaccine. Then you're talking about a variant-specific vaccine, and we need to constantly be looking at those data. That's what would reassure me from the CDC.
We need to take a picture of you and I for Twitter, although you are not on Twitter. We need to get you.
I think I have a like at Dr. Paul Offit thing, I think.
Okay, then I'll put that. Paul, I'm very grateful for your time. I really appreciate the generous time you provide me and the listeners, and I look forward to hopefully having you next year, and we talk about something completely different. And I'm looking forward to reading your book.
It sounds good. Thanks. It was my pleasure. I enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.